Welcome, everyone, to a brand new episode of the Jams and Tea podcast where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And today, this week, I am rejoining the podcast, but and unfortunately, this is it's like an algebraic equation. Once I'm figured back into one side, we must subtract. So two of our members are not here this week. Morgan and August, regrettably, could not make it. But in their stead, we have gotten back the other Nebraskan mainstay. We have Connor with us today. So
hello, everyone.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're thrilled to have Connor back, especially considering that Connor has been a guest on two of my record clubs in the past, but is so far the only guest we've had that hasn't been on one of our main episodes proper. So there might be some viewers who haven't seen Connor on the channel yet, if you only watched the main episode. So Connor, welcome.
Glad to be here, as always.
And I think I'm pretty glad to be here too, man. This week on the channel, we've had a lot of good stuff go up. We did our record club for Neutral Milk Hotels in the airplane over the sea. We also did the episode that I wasn't a part of, which is the Casey Musgraves and Lowe's. I really got a kick of how every time you said that album title, you were just like, hey, what?
Yeah.
Just because I could never read it in any other way. But we also had our record club, our 1991 retrospective on Nirvana's Nevermind, which is apt because this week we're following it up with the 1991 retrospective on Soundgarden's Bad Motorfinger, which, of course, another grunge classic of 1991, which also ties into both the Pearl Jam 10 video and the Temple of the Dog videos, which we've done. So if you haven't seen those, might want to brush up or look back on those a little bit, get a little bit more of the context informed. And we had a new Let's Play video uploaded today. But today, we're going to be talking about two new records. We're going to be talking about the new album from another act we have reviewed before in a record club. We reviewed Thrice's Visu with Morgan on a record club a long ass time ago. And we're going to be reviewing their new album, Horizons/East. Good name, guys. Really rolls off the tongue well. And we're going to be talking about the new Injury Reserve by the time I get to Phoenix. Yes. And after that, we have the record club, which is going to be on La Dispute's Wildlife. It's Tyler's recommended album.
Yep.
So we got our work cut out for us today, truthfully.
Yeah, it's going to be a good time. It's going to be, fun, as always. But before we kind of get into the reviews, we talk about music that we have been listening to of any description and kind over the last 7 days, or in the case of Connor, anything that you've been listening to recently at all. But Jake, we'll kick off with you. What have you been listening to? I guess over the last 2 weeks, since you haven't been on the show for a couple of weeks.
Well, I've been listening to, first of all, I want to shout out something that I can't remember if you shouted it out. But I know I listened to it because of you, and that's the new Indigo de Souza album, Any Shape You Take.
Yes.
Which is the new kind of like indie singer-songwriter thing. And it's really, really great. I co-sign anything good Tyler has ever said about the album. That's one that I really, really like upon first listen, but I'm just I can tell that this album's going to be a mainstay with me for a while. I could realistically even see it maybe even breaking my top 10 for the year. It's really, really good. She's a phenomenal songwriter. She has a really, really interesting approach to sound. It's I don't really think I've heard many records this year that sound quite like that. And just generally speaking, I emotionally responded to it. It's a very, very good record. It's not particularly very long, but I still think it's really, really developed and cool. Give it a look if you haven't. She deserves to have more people talking about her, frankly. I kind of got on a little bit of an ambient kick because I have been listening, just needed just sort of that kind of background music or just music to help chill a little bit. I listened to an album I mentioned before, which is the Harold Budd and Brian Eno collaboration, The Pearl, which is, I think, my favorite ambient album ever now at this point. It's if you like the Cocteau Twins album, The Moon and the Melodies, you'll really like this. It's like I know that this sounds bad, that it's like that album, but without Elizabeth Fraser. But take a step back and replace her with Brian Eno, then we're cooking with gas. It's basically an album that is like floating through space. It's like cosmic and beautiful, and it's just like every time I hear that one of those effects drenched Harold Budd piano notes, I'm just like, yes, take me. If I were to die right now, I would be at peace. Terrific album, but it also kind of got the conversation started. We were talking about ambient records a lot, and that the conversation eventually went into talking about Tim Hecker. So I went and listened to, like, man has his name on a dozen fucking albums. So I was just like, I'm literally just going to pick one. I was like, hey, this album art looks cool. And I listened to Fantasma, Parastasie by Tim Hecker, which is this really, really noisy, really, really like, I would almost describe it as dirty. But if you're at all familiar with Tim Hecker's work, it shouldn't be surprising that that's kind of what this album sounds like. It manages to, like, the first track is this really, really noisy and kind of like just loud. It doesn't even feel like ambient music. It's really just sort of a tone setter for like the mood. But then after that, it kind of lulls you in a little bit with like all this harsh noise. But eventually he just finds the beauty in it somehow, despite working with like the ugliest possible sound palette, which is something I really like about him. It's just like I'm listening to his stuff. It actually gives me the same vibe as like the new Paranormal record, where it's just like so abrasive and noisy, and it's so committed to that, but it's also so spacious that you just find a weird like peace in it. And I really, really like that about it. I don't think I liked it as much as the other Hecker project I've heard, which is Virgins, but it's only slightly. I'd still say it's definitely worth checking out. I did sort of this is a strange back-to-back listen that I did. Vaguely some psychedelic rock similarities between the two, but I listened to I listened to the new remaster of Spiritualized, Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space, which I've talked about months ago. Like, that had to have been last year. Because I listened to that because Tyler was like emphatically recommending that and Laser Guided Melodies, and I was like, yo. And so I listened to that, and I mean, good gosh golly, that album sounded good before. It sounds good now. Like, god damn, man, that's a record that is just, every time I throw that shit on, it's like, it feels life altering. Like, it genuinely feels like I'm listening to it for the first time every single time. It's such a big, bombastic, explosive thing, and it's also just this drug-fueled haze. It's like this, just showcasing beautifully the highs and lows of feeling like you're in love or experiencing love, and then the inevitable downward spiral that comes from heartbreak. And it's just drenched in space rock gospel choir shit. It's like somebody just took all of my favorite elements about this genre of alt rock and just like, all right, just fucking shove it into one album. And when you end your album on like a fucking 17-minute long noise track like Cop Shoot Cop, I'm here.
I would describe it as noise gospel, which is like as fucking cool as it sounds.
Fucking
like
cool.
Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space is like, it's a fucking diamond of an album. Like, it's so rare, and to get an album that sounds as huge as it does, maintains this incredible sweep that it has, and it just instantly feels like a classic from the opening seconds, and it doesn't let you out of its grip the whole way through. Beautifully ebbs and flows from moments of just like sustained chaos to moments of like absolute serenity, and it just, mind-blowing. I would say as well, like, if you are seeking more of the hit, then don't limit yourself to 90s Spiritualized. They actually have some great later records as well. Like the record they put out after it, Let It Come Down, is really underrated. Not quite as bombastic as that, but a similar sort of vibe. And I'm also very fond of their album Sweetheart Sweet Light from 2012, which is super underrated. And so they've always like consistently been pretty good. But
I need to.
When you have a record like Ladies and Gentlemen, We're Floating in Space, it's a Halley's Comet thing of like cosmic rarity, that you have to kind of treasure it.
It is kind of hard to believe it exists when you're listening to it. You're just like, damn, why the fuck? Like, can somebody else start making records exactly like this? Like, I know, just like, oh, we'll do pale imitation of that sound. It's just like, I just want more shit that sounds like it. So I need to listen to more Spiritualized. So and I think because of the remaster, at least I've seen this on the Spiritualized Reddit, is that there is speculation that they're going to be remastering some of the albums that follow. So that could be a good way to get into them as of late. And the last record I'm going to mention here is the resurgence of an album I have once again talked about before, but I need to hammer home because this is a band that not enough people listen to or talk about, and that is Spoons. They Want My Soul. Currently my favorite album by that band, even though I've only really heard 3 of their records, but I like all of them immensely. I have them all at a 9, and this one is probably going to go up in the future. It just needs to live with me a while longer, but my god, oh my god, how is every fucking song on that album is just like, oh, this is such a fucking banger. And then it's just like, oh, hey, this one is too. Oh, wow, this one, look at that. Oh my God, it's just consistently excellent. What the fuck? And I love the way the album just sort of like, they have like a more spacious sound on there, which is a really stark contrast to Ga 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 Ga, which is like a really more rowdy kind of intimate album, and this is just like the complete opposite on the gradient of that record. It's like one of the most underrated rock albums of the 2010s. I mean, it's fucking, or is it 2000s? I don't remember the exact release date for They Want My Soul. I think it's 2010s.
It's 2014, that album.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But that's the thing with Spoon, is that all of their albums are so weirdly timeless that it's like, if you told me that Gaga 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 came out in like 1995, I'd be like, yeah, I mean, it could have. It probably wouldn't have sounded quite as good just because their albums are mixed and mastered fucking immaculately. Like, I cannot stress that enough. That is some of the best production work in all of rock music. It's insane.
They're a great example of a band that are like, at heart, like fundamentals rock band that are very rhythm section focused. But what elevates them is the way on every single record they use studio. They really take advantage of the studio as an instrument to like completely add an additional dimension to their songs. That's what makes them so unique, is the way that like studio sound. I think it's probably more true of a record like Gaga 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 than They Want My Soul, but the studio sound and just effects and the way that they use the environment that they're recording in and incorporate that into the recordings is a big part of the atmosphere of their records. And
no better showcase than on Transference, honestly. I think that's an album that almost like takes advantage of production about as well as any rock album can.
It's that will be a really interesting record club someday, potentially, that album, because I got a lot to say about that. It's my favorite Spoon record. But
it's a quintessentially Tyler pick for that one. That's and it's like, oh god, that's such an interesting album. It's so like intentionally messy, but like in a really, really, really compelling way. It's never in a way that like throws you off guard or like holds you at a distance. It's always in a way that's just like, what is the purpose behind this choice? And you're just kind of like, it forces you to interrogate it in an interesting way. And I just want to shout out the fact that during me talking about Spiritualized, I was about to say that it was important because that's my favorite album of 1997. And then I looked closer and I'm like, no, it's actually not, because Ocean Machine came out that year. And I was like, God, 1997, the year that birthed me. And I'm definitely not as good as those 3 albums. So
it was a pretty
it dropped Jake and Tyler.
It was a pretty fucking heated year, to be honest. Like, I think that might be the year that has the most individual like 10 rated records from me of any given year, actually.
Yeah, thinking that might be the same for me too, because that god, it's fucking ridiculous. And across all genres too. It was just a fucking embarrassment of riches for every corner of music.
Yeah, like Homogenic, I think, came out that year.
Homogenic came out that year.
A Sharp Infinity came out that year, I think.
I Can Hear the Heart Beating as One came out that year.
Oh, damn.
Perfect From Now On, I think.
Perfect From Now On by Built to Spill did. What else? Chiastic Slide by Orticker came out that year.
For the shit, yeah.
Wait, Is Lonesome Crowded West 97?
I believe it
remember.
is. Yeah, I think so. I think it is 97.
I'm gonna fact check myself.
No, it
Either
is.
or by Elliott Smith.
Yeah.
Yep, it is.
There's a Fishman's album that came out that year too. Dots
Yes.
and Loops by Stereo Lab.
Yes.
Fucking
Great
Velvet
album.
Rope by Janet Jackson. Fuck me.
Did you
this
say
is just
City by
stacked.
Strapping Young Lad, or did I miss that?
City by Strapping Young Lad as well. Oh god, that one's up there
Okay,
too.
Computer.
Portishead self-titled.
Okay,
I
Computer.
Damn.
love that City and Ocean Machine Biomech are 26 and 27 respectively on Rate Your Music for 1997, right next to each other.
Slater Kinney's Dig Me Out.
Nick Cave's The Boatman's Call.
Yeah.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
It's
Around
ridiculous.
Around the Fur.
Oh no.
God
Oh
damn,
my
dude.
god.
It was
There's
absurd.
so much.
Yeah. Absurd year.
I can't handle this fucking shit, man. All right. And an obscene amount of good soundtrack work. Fucking the Lost Highway soundtrack, the Berserk score, the Evangelion score. Like, Jesus Christ. Take me back to when I was an infant.
I just want to go back.
The Fat of
to
the Land.
1997.
Fat of the Land. We talked about that semi recently.
We did.
Oh, that music
Mogwai's
video for
debut,
that one
yeah.
video. Oh, that was so rad.
I watched a great video from the fantastic YouTube channel Trash Theory, who does like short documentaries on UK music, like throughout the years and like particular eras and niches and stuff. And they did a fantastic video on the Prodigy and the rise of like their particular brand of dance music that blended sort of dance and hip hop and metal aesthetics as well, and how that culminated with Fat of the Land, an album you have to hear, Jake. Just like, it's like a cross section of a lot of musical influences that are like really like baked into you. So I think you'll really enjoy it, but it's in a mode that you're not like as familiar with in terms of like UK dance music. So yeah, you'll really dig the shit out of that. I think that's a real like gateway record into a whole subculture of music. And also that incidentally the same year as another record that I actually like narrowly more that fits into the same niche, which is the Chemical Brothers' Dig Your Own Hole, which we're going to discuss next year because it turns 25, I think, a couple of days before I do. So, and it's a record that's been in my life since I was literally a toddler. So that's going to be a really like fun record to talk about. But anyway, that's a whole different tangent. Well, I'll get into what I've been listening to then recently. So the first thing I want to shout out,
From the
not
J
a lot of
to the T.
Yeah, not a lot of new listens, although there have been a few. Most notably, though, I finally, at the grave insistence of Jake, have begun to dig into the discography of Placebo, which is a band that I, for whatever reason, have never listened to. I don't actually have a good reason for that because they're peripheral to a lot of music that I grew up with, and you know, aesthetically, they fit in with a lot of bands that have been important to me for a long time, and yet for whatever reason, I never listened to Placebo. I don't know what it is. But anyway, I started from the top. I started from their debut record, self-titled album, which I thoroughly enjoyed. I was really taken by the sound that this band has, the urgency of the vocalist, just generally the sound and the aesthetic was really, really sharp. I particularly loved the opening track on that record, which the name is now escaping me without having it in front of me, but that was a stunning song. And so I definitely can see with the how this band could even develop even further from this launching point, but I thought that it was still a really impressive debut record. And so I'm gonna listen to their second record sometime in the next week as well. So I look forward to that.
Which is the second one? I actually don't. Is that Without You I'm Nothing?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay,
that's
that's considered to be a highlight.
Yeah,
All right.
I love that record.
I'm really looking forward to it. If we do have any Placebo fans watching as well, let us know what you think. Yeah,
I think people underrate the self-titled a little bit, honestly. I think I did for a while there too. But it's definitely an album like they're just a band that like they have like two really considered canon classics and everybody just kind of ignores everything around them, which is a bit ridiculous. I kind of co-sign what Morgan said a couple weeks ago when I wasn't here, when he talked about their most recent album, which is not like it might be their weakest, but I would never say it's a bad album, even though he brought forth one of the best lyrics the band's ever penned with the "my computer thinks I'm gay."
Yeah.
I feel like I remember where I was when I first heard that. I was on my college campus and I just burst out laughing.
You absolutely, I mean, I've never heard the song, but you absolutely nailed Morgan's impersonation of Brian Molko.
Yeah, that's what I was going for.
Just like incredible. That was exactly the sound of Morgan doing that voice.
It's a bit of an acquired taste. I kind of compare his vocal presence to that of like Billy Corgan on early Smashing Pumpkins albums. It's kind of that same weird squeaky thing he's got with his tenor, but like the band utilize it in a really effective way. I think if everyone go check out the final song on their most recent album that Morgan talked about, called Bosco, which is like the best Placebo song in my opinion. Breaks my fucking heart every time I hear it.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I'm excited to get for like Sleeping with Ghosts and shit, and Meds. You'll really like those two, I think.
I look forward to them. I also took the opportunity this week to continue my dive through the dense and strange discography of the avant-garde metal band KO. I listened to their 2010 album Coyote, and it feels weird to call them an avant-garde metal act at this particular juncture, because, I mean, Choirs of the Eye is probably the best avant-garde metal record I've heard. That's a stunning album, but they have kind of drifted away from metal and metal aesthetics with each subsequent record, which is not a bad thing, but it puts them in an even more stranger and place where they are difficult to really get a handle on, and their music is kind of elusive, and it's very kind of incorporating jazzier structures and stuff. And so the subsequent records, Dowsing Anemone with Copper Tongue and Blue Lambency Downward, were decent records that had interesting moments and were kind of more conceptually fascinating than musically. Just didn't really last with me the way I hoped they would. But Coyote, while still, I think, suffering from some of the same issues of languorousness that those records have, is a slightly more successful iteration. It does help that it has a reasonably unified concept, and it's reasonably short at just shy of 40 minutes. But it's still like the emphasis is still very much on the violin and horn parts and the weird contributions that are added into these mixes. And yeah, it's still like, I'm still kind of a bit at a loss for what to make of this band, to be honest, and but they definitely tried to do something different with each subsequent record. And so I'm going to be spending some more time with Coyote, as I have with all their records thus far, to try and get a stronger handle on it before I move on to the next record. But it continues to be a fascinating discography that I'm kind of getting a bit lost in to a certain extent. Okay, so I already shouted this out last week, but I have been absolutely addicted to the debut record of the Beths, Future Me Hates Me, which we reviewed their sophomore record last year. Again, I stand by my statement that I don't quite love that record as much as I want to, but the debut album is just fucking goes from start to finish. It's like so fucking intense, and like just some of the best power pop you'll hear anywhere. Like it's just not a single ballad, it's just front to back bangers, and it fucking rules. I adore it, and I'm like breathing this huge sigh of relief that I found something from this band that I do connect with, because they are like one of the most popular internationally indie bands from my country, and so it's nice to finally be getting it a bit more. But yeah, no, that record Future Me Hates Me is amazing. I know I talked about it last week, but literally I spent more time listening to that this week than any of the records we're reviewing, which I still spend a lot of time listening to. But anyway, so there's that.
So fucking good.
I also listened to yesterday, at the prompting of Zach, I re-listened to the Of Montreal album, Skeletal Lamping. So Of Montreal, for those who don't know, are the ongoing multi-decade running act of one Kevin Barnes, who is a very singular queer artist who has made like 25 albums under the Of Montreal name. I've heard almost all of them. I went through a really big phase as a teenager where I was very, very into Of Montreal, but a lot of the records I haven't revisited in a long time. But anyway, I re-listened
The phase is called being bisexual.
Let me tell you about this album, right? So Skeletal Lamping, it's a very divisive record. It's not remotely one of my favorite records they've made, but like Of Montreal are a really interesting act because like even when they misfire, they do in a really interesting way. And so this is a concept record where Kevin takes on the persona of a sex addicted transvestite rock star called Georgie Fruit. And it's basically a song cycle about the sexual escapades of this character, and it's an absolutely batshit album. It is an album where songs will just like abruptly change instrumentation for no apparent reason right in the middle with no transition at all. It's a fucking mess of an album. It's absolutely not a record I recommend listening to if you're unfamiliar with Of Montreal, but I wanted to shout it out because I re-listened to it yesterday and found it thoroughly entertaining. But like Of Montreal are a great band with a lot of fantastic records. If like art pop with a really kind of verbose and just kind of nutso queer sensibility appeals to you, records like Hissing Fauna, Are You the Destroyer, Satanic Panic in the Attic, and Paralytic Stalks are well worth checking out because those are excellent albums. Yeah. Anyway, one more thing I want to shout out though is that I re-listened to a record that is an absolute classic to me, one of the greatest electronic and most influential electronic music records of all time. 6 perfect compositions of minimalist, to be sure, but absolutely stunning melodic brilliance. Kraftwerk's The Man Machine, my favorite Kraftwerk record, an absolutely incredible. Like the melodies on this album are like timeless. They're like fucking Beethoven levels of like, how did you come up with something so simple but so perfect? How did you do it? And also the soundscapes, like it's a real like exercise in all that you could do with synthesizers in the 70s to create these incredible soundscapes. Like I said, it's quite minimal. So if you're expecting and you're into electronic music that throws a lot of shit at you to like overwhelm your senses, you might not vibe with Kraftwerk or this record as much. But to me, this is some of their most refined and focused and beautiful compositions, along with Computer World, which immediately followed it. I think those are the 2 best Kraftwerk records because they're the 2 strongest melodically and because they're the 2 that have the greatest sense of richness in their atmosphere across the whole album. Like if I were to say, if someone were to ask me what the best Kraftwerk song is, I'd probably say Autobahn, off of Autobahn, but then the second half of that record is not quite, is kind of just a little undercooked compared to that opus, that 22-minute opus on the A side of that record. Whereas records like Man Machine and Computer World are really consistent front to back. And with Man Machine, I think being the most refined and perfect set of songs that Kraftwerk ever did. So yeah, if you're just interested in the history of electronic music and hearing one of the most just pristine in terms of composition records ever, then listen to the Man Machine. It's just like perfect. It's just like utterly stunning. So, and I also will shout out that last week I shouted out the new Sleigh Bells record, Texas, which I've still been listening to on and off as well, and is still really riotously entertaining, as you would want from any Sleigh Bells record. I've really been enjoying it. But yesterday I also took the time to go back and revisit their debut album, Treats, as well, which is one of the most insane, chaotic, noisy, utterly ridiculous records of the last 20 years, and will always hold a very, very close place in my heart because of how utterly ballistic it is. there's songs on this record that are mastered as though as though they have been decayed, like William Basinski's tape loops. Like there's songs on here that just unambiguously sound terrible, and yet because of what they are and because of how hard they go, that shittiness becomes part of the joy of the experience. Like the brick walling is just like part of the fucking sick addiction of that album. It's a trip, and it has to be heard by every single person at least once. And yeah, that's enough.
Crown on the ground and
That's yes. Connor's got
that song is ridiculous.
that song sounds like it sounds like cancer. Like it's produced like I can't even think of what to compare it to. But yeah, that album is a trip, and I fucking love it. Anyway, that's enough from me. Connor, what have you been listening to recently that you want to shout out music-wise?
Yeah, so as Tyler already mentioned, I went through the discography of Thrice. I did that because, last week you told me that I could be on this episode, and so I was like, oh, an excuse to go through all the Thrice albums, and I did it all in a week, including yesterday I listened to 5 albums, which is probably the most from a single artist that I've ever listened to in a single day. I can't remember the last time I did that. There were a few, of course they're one of my favorite bands, and I really love like their earlier post-hardcore direction
Artist
that they
in the
had
Ambulance.
with albums. Yep, Artist in the Ambulance, Illusion of Safety, which is also amazing.
Yep.
I'm my favorite that they've ever released is Visu, which is the one that y'all have already reviewed, and Visu is kind of like the turning point of their whole career trajectory. And so the ones that there are a couple that I never heard, which was the debut Identity Crisis, which is pretty good, although it's certainly a rough debut. It's got some great riffs, some great, musicianship, something that's been consistent throughout their entire career. But you could tell that the songwriting is not quite there, and they would improve that like greatly.
Yeah.
With the subsequent albums and the production as well. Also, like Jake said, the Alchemy Indexes, I have heard them before, but I didn't have them rated because I couldn't remember like what I thought of each one. But I think they're awesome. I do think in some places it's a little inconsistent for me, mainly on the Earth side, but I still love all of the sides, especially the Fire
That's
and Water.
probably my least favorite. Oh, Fire and Water, fucking
Fire and Water is just incredible.
Hard.
I mean,
Water
it
in
literally
general is
sounds
just like it's so weird. I love it.
Yeah, for sure. And I know, Jake, how much you love the song Digital Sea, and that is easily one of their best songs.
So fucking, that opening is just so fucking like iconic to me at this point. I hear that and I'm just like, oh shit, it's so dense. God, they're so, and the Fire side is just like, hey, do you want to hear them go as hard as they've gone on like Artist in the Ambulance? Like since then, it's like, yeah, yes. And then Fire Breather comes on and you're like, oh my God.
Yeah. Fun fact, actually, the first song that I ever heard from Thrice was the song The Arsonist. And that's only because it was actually on Guitar Hero Arcade as a kid when I played Guitar Hero.
That must have been fun.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it. I was just like, let's try this. And then immediately it's just like, a child beneath the fall. I'm like, what is this? Because I'd never heard music like that.
Dustin Kensler just losing his fucking mind.
Watch the city burn. It's just, yeah. So good.
Sounds like the lead singer of Daughters on their most recent album.
He does on that song. Yeah, he really does.
Fucking awesome.
So good.
Beneath the floorboards.
God, and the riff too. Oh my God.
Oh, it's so fucking sexy.
Yes. And then I will say about Air and Earth, even though I prefer Fire and Water, the Air side actually has my favorite Thrice song ever, which is the song Daedalus.
Really?
I don't know. Am I saying that right? I don't know.
Oh, yes.
Which is,
Yes.
I mean, like lyrically, it's about that story, like about flying, Icarus flying too close to the sun, and Daedalus is like his father, and it's so like spacious and emotional, and then when it like goes back down, and then the climax comes, and he's just screaming like, "Oh God!" Like, just almost, he sounds like he's crying, and it's just such a powerful song.
Vocally is part of the reason why that's my favorite like Thrice project, is that I think it's like he really just is so dynamic on all four of those, like, and Silver Wings on Air.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's so good. The other ones, like, I had never heard Beggars before, and that was an interesting one. I really like that album. It's definitely more like reserved than it's kind of, that's the album where they kind of let go of being like super hardcore, I guess. And they kind of take it in a more alt rock direction, but there's some really interesting stuff happening on that album. I really enjoyed that. Conversely, I did not really enjoy Palms, which is their album before this, and
spectacularly mid.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk more about Thrice, so I won't spend more time on that. So as of recently, I'll say real quick, I listened to, of course, the latest Casey Musgraves album, which was bad, but you can just watch the Jams and Tea review for that. That's all I'm gonna say about that.
Yes.
He's a breadwinner. He wants your dinner.
Yep.
I absolutely love how like upset Saoirse was by that "he wants your dinner" line. Because like
it was exactly how I reacted. I couldn't.
It just like every time I listened to the record, that just kind of like brushed over me. But then when she pointed it out, and I was like, you know what? Actually, yeah, that's a really bad lyric. Like he wants. Like, I get what she's saying, but like, it's like a dog.
I am literally just imagining Rustin Kelly dressed like a normal dude in a beanie cap, walking home and just being like, "Give me the breadsticks, honey."
Oh man,
it's such a stupid image.
Yeah.
Oh God.
Anyway,
don't even get me started about the closer.
Oh.
So bad.
Casey, we're praying for you. We can tell you're going through it.
I am so glad that like I since we didn't talk about the Casey Musgraves album before, and so I had like written up my review for it to send because I knew I wasn't gonna be able to make it that day, and I was just like, is this going to be one of those things? Because like Tyler was really looking forward to this record, and he was like really dead set on being like, oh, I think this is going to be like a masterpiece or something. And I was like, am I going to be the guy, like they're just going to read their opinion and just be like, God, Jake's such a fucking idiot. Why doesn't he like this? And then I watched back the review and everybody's just like, this fucking sucks. I'm like, oh, okay, good.
Yeah, like
thank God.
I've never been more sure without a shred of evidence that this record was rushed to the point of being unfinished when it was released. And like I genuinely believe something happened behind the scenes to halt the progress of this record and to prevent it from being finished. Like I don't believe that this is the full finished project that Casey envisioned, just because I don't see how it could be. It's just so like undercooked, and like the lyricism is so like pedestrian and just like she's capable of so much better, and I don't understand because I don't get it. It just doesn't make sense to me. It's confounded me, and I stand by my statement. It is by far the most disappointing album of the year.
I think what happened with the release is that they wanted to coincide with Drake's new album. Oh wait, no, that's a wrong album. Sorry.
Casey, Drake, and Kanye West feuding.
The funniest part of the whole scenario has been seeing all the pop gays like desperately reaching to like defend this album that they have invested themselves in being amazing before it even came out. Anyway, that's all in the past. Anything else you've been listening to, Connor?
Yeah. So I've kind of, instead of focusing on like new releases, I've kind of like rediscovered albums that I've previously loved. but I haven't heard in a while.
Love when that happens.
And yeah, the first one is actually an album called El Cielo, and it's by the band Dredge. It's a very like this is probably the third time I mentioned this website, Sputnik Music. It's a
Real one to
big
remember.
Sputnik. Yeah, it's a big Sputnik album. It's actually bolded on Rate Your Music. I didn't even realize that, but it's like I don't know how to describe it. I guess it's like progressive rock, alternative rock from the 2000s, but it's not super technical, although there's very like technical things about it. Like the drumming is incredible. It's so tight and so punchy, and like the guitar work, there's nothing like crazy, but it's always sharp, amazing like chord voicings and amazing use of effects. There's even a lot of like pedal steel. Is that the name? Or like lap steel guitar that the singer does when he's not singing, and it creates just this amazing like atmosphere that resonates throughout the whole album. It's a very ambitious, very like artistic rock album. And then another record I think people should check out more, one that I recently got back into, is the album by the band Fear Before the March of Flames, which is quite the band name. They're actually,
that's fucking awesome.
Yeah, they actually changed their name to Fear Before, I think, at the end of their career. But if you find it on Rate Your Music, it's just Fear Before the March of Flames. But
I downloaded this album that you're about to shout out, but I haven't had a chance to listen to it yet.
Yeah, I did too.
Oh yeah, sweet.
This is the Always Open Mouth, no?
Yes, yeah, they always open mouth, and it is just fucking insane. It's a post-hardcore album, but every track just does its own complete unique thing. There's a lot of like weird synth textures too that come in. There's a lot of unique guitar work, like the song, not the actual opener, but because the opener is like a 1 minute short thing, but when it goes into that and then into the second track, which is called Drowning the Old Hag, one of my favorite song titles, it is the most sludgy, disgusting, heaviest shit I've ever heard. It's just
dope.
Yeah, and the vocals are insane. There's so many different vocal styles throughout the album, where it's like screaming, almost growling, or even just layered singing, even robot style vocals on some tracks. Like it's an absolute journey of a record. You might not know what to make of it on first listen. And the song, there's a song on there called My Fucking Deer Hunter, another great title. And I swear to God, that's maybe one of the 10 most incredible choruses I've ever heard of like any song, maybe, just because it just comes in full force and just, you just have to hear it. It's insane.
A brief tutorial in Bacchanalia, parentheses, cigarettes is currency. Now that is a song title.
Yeah, it's just it's remarkably consistent, but also consistently experimental. So like nothing ever feels like it's completely out of place. It kind of reminds me of like The Shape of Punk to Come by Refused, because that album has a lot of different like styles and influences and sounds and textures, but this goes even further than that in the experimental territory. And it's filthy, it's spacey, it's everything. It's becoming one of my favorite records. So I think that's pretty much all I wanted to shout out.
Sick. Well, thank you for taking the opportunity to put those records on our radars. Let's now then jump into our first review of the day, which is, of course, Injury Reserve are a sort of underground rap group who have been around for not quite a decade, but coming up on it. They've sort of made waves very gradually with a very particular kind of brand of sort of hipster adjacent hip hop, and just a really exciting group that turned a lot of heads with their unique and fun approach to, hip hop and this particular style of music that I have. That I see them very much as a precursor to a group like Brockhampton, for example,
Yeah.
because they have a similar sort of energy, but they came earlier and they were operating at the peak of that earlier than Brockhampton when they came onto the scene. But yeah, so they were a trio comprising the producer Parker Corey and the MCs and writers and creatives Richie with a T and Stepper J Groggs. And I became aware of them shortly after they released their 2016 mixtape Floss, which I think made a lot of waves at the time that it came out. It came on hot on the heels of a mixtape called Live at the Dentist Office, which preceded it, both of which gave them a kind of groundswell of attention and hype. And that then gradually built to the release of their debut album, Injury Reserve, a self-titled record which came out in 2019, I think. And so I didn't feel that the self-titled album had quite the finesse of the mixtapes and EPs that preceded it, although it had a lot of great songs on it. But less so than worrying about album structure and all those kinds of things. I've always just found that I've been taken by the sheer energy that Injury Reserve commit to their performances and to their music, and the ways in which, as they've progressed, that energy and the style and the sound has kind of gotten more and more sort of unhinged and away from the kind of party pop rap sort of origins that they flirted with in their early days, which still had a kind of experimental tinge to them, into this realm of creative sampling and really unusual song structures and this idea of unpredictability in terms of within a particular project, they could veer in multiple different directions from track to track without any kind of warning. And they were totally unafraid to eschew conventional structure, even on their self-titled record within songs as well. And so they're always kind of exciting. And I mean, for me anyway, there was a sense of anticipation of, okay, they're still sort of finding their feet, and I'm very curious to see what will happen next. And that's kind of something that I felt with every subsequent release, including their 2017 EP, Drive It Like It's Stolen, which incidentally I highly recommend. Really strong EP, has a number of their best songs on it. So that's where we were at. And then last year, we learned the tragic news of Stepper J Groggs' passing, which you'll all be keenly aware of. Sudden. We don't have any of the information as to why, and obviously we're not entitled to it, and it doesn't, it's this information that we know that he's gone, and that this record, their second studio album, by the time I get to Phoenix, was well underway in terms of production by the time of his death. In fact, the exact amount of work that had to be done on the album, or work that ended up on the album after his death, is unclear. But I think from the interviews that I've seen, Parker and Richie have tried to be pretty clear that most of this record, including its entire concept, was conceptualized and put together and recorded before Groggs' death. But as with any posthumous release, whether it's a posthumous artist, solo artist, or whether it is a band with a member who has passed away, it is difficult for that contextual information not to inform the way you experience this record. And I think that it has heavily informed the way that people in general have experienced this record, including myself, and I'm sure including both of you to a certain extent as well, especially because the general tone of the album is so dour and relentlessly bleak, frankly, and it has this sheer chaos to the way that it's constructed that is very difficult to describe concisely, and certainly is kind of overwhelming to experience. I mean, it took me a long time I was kind of bowled over and bewildered by this record when I first encountered it with the day that it came out. But I still struggled to process what it is that I was hearing and what it is they're trying to do with it. But how have you guys found your experience encountering this record, the context that you have for this band's journey, and how this album strikes you when you listen to it now?
I've actually been aware of Injury Reserve since around like 2019, I think. And I've actually been a pretty big fan all the while. And so, I mean, and it's not like I didn't follow them like super closely. I was still sort of like catching up with the zeitgeist of when I think one of their mixtapes dropped at the time, or an EP or something. And I was just really taken aback with how like creative they were. They're just I admired their sort of ethos in the same way that I do admire something like Brockhampton. And I'm glad I'm not the first person to bring them up, because there's a very obvious elephant in the room comparison that I'll make with this album, and that like it's definitely far more unprecedented of a like sonic directional change than this. But this is like, if we're going to compare those two groups, this is certainly their iridescence, in a way that you sort of hear it and you're just kind of immediately struck by how urgently chaotic everything is, and how noisy and dense some of these mixes are. When I was listening to this on songs like Superman That, I was taken right back to some of the songs in sort of the middle stretch of Iridescence, like District, where it's just overpowering. Like I even sort of struggle to call this a hip hop album, which is certainly part of it, but the way I listen to this is kind of like, it's like an industrial noise album. It's not constructed in a way that like any of their previous work was. Like even on stuff like the second half of the self-titled, which is certainly a little bit more interior and less focused on being like bangers, songs like that were the diametrically opposed to stuff like Gravy and Biscuits or Jailbreak the Tesla, when they could get a little bit more like like obviously experimental, and like stuff they did on their earlier mixtapes too, is that this is still such a step forward from all of that in approach that like Tyler, when I first listened to this, I was just like, I don't like you kind of got to get in there and just sink your teeth into it, because this is not an album that you can listen to like a normal hip hop record, or a normal, like, you have to really look into the lyrics a lot of the times, because you might not even be able to technically hear them, just because there's some times of like overpowering bass and sound effects in this that are just flattening. Like the best way I can describe this record consistently is oppressive. It's an album that almost feels kind of like, I would also compare it sonically, at least in parts, to something like Death Grips, where it's just really, really focused on impact. And but there's also stuff that like they haven't really done. I think they like, the thing that took me the most off guard was actually how much like singing there is on it, but it's auto-tuned so much, and it has so many, like, it's like slathered in effects that it kind of sounds like the chipmunk vocals on like a Brockhampton song, but it's like melancholic in a way that none of those really are. No better showcased on a song like Superman That, or what is maybe the highlight of Injury Reserve's career thus far for me, which is the song Top Picks for You, which is genuinely the most devastating song I've heard in 2021. Like there is so much like difficulty and sadness and grief and struggle on this album that is baked into its sonic and lyrical identity, and it reaches an apex on that song that just I did not see coming. And it's a lot of it sounds like spoken word on this, but it's just backed with this like dissonant guitar that's just kind of wailing in the background the whole time, and you're just sort of listening to this screed happen. And man, by the time this gets halfway through, I'm just in tears. It's relentless. It's a very difficult album to engage with, and I honestly can really understand any viewpoint on it, really.
I've been a big fan of Injury Reserve for a few years now. I didn't really get into them like when they were starting out. I got kind of into them after like some friends were telling me, you got to check out Injury Reserve. I was like, okay. And I absolutely love Floss. I think it's an amazing, one of my favorite mixtapes. Live from the Dentist Office is great too. And I also love the self-titled, even though it is a little more, I guess, inconsistent in spots. But like this album, man, like there was absolutely no indication that they were gonna head in this direction. I feel like
None.
like not at all. Like maybe a little bit more experimental than the self-titled, but this just like, I mean, there's a reason people are just constantly talking about it right now, because it's just like this just doesn't sound like anything like that's ever been released. I mean, and we can make comparisons like, Death Grips and Clipping and Brockhampton, and even not sure if I'm saying this right, but Dalek, or if you've ever heard of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, but really this is just such a singular album, and it's like the sonic palette overall, it's just so incredibly unique.
None of the comparisons fully fit, frankly. It's genuinely like you said, I mean, it's not even unprecedented for Injury Reserve. I can't remember the last time I heard anything like this, frankly.
Yeah, and I think that might be a kind of common thread to this hype and just general excitement around this record, is just like people don't really know what to make of it, how to really even begin to engage with it. Like the immediate temptation is to read onto it all of these sorts of potential meanings or significance or emotional weight, which, I'm not saying isn't there, but like the way you kind of want to respond to a record like this immediately is by trying to emotionally understand it. And that's how I've kind of tried to, come to terms with this album and what it is throughout the week. And it's left me utterly bewildered. And like this sense of disorder and chaos that it has is not even like solely in the instrumentation and the production, but like, I like what you said, Jake, about it not even really feeling like a hip hop record a lot of points, like even expanding the boundaries of, like, people are saying it's this kind of landmark and experimental hip hop, which is an incredibly nebulous term that I don't really know what the limits are. But I mean,
nebulous.
But I mean, like, if you take, for example, the opening track on this record, like the vocal performances on Outside, like the Richie with a T, like literally like sounding like he's been running up a hill for like 5 miles and then just immediately stumbling into the studio and just stuttering over himself. Like it feels almost a stretch to call it a verse. Like there's a decent amount of time that passes where he is saying noises with his mouth that before you can even interpret the fact that he's trying to say words. Like and that sense of like just exhaustion is all over this record.
Yeah, like regarding that opening track, Outside, which is it's the perfect way to start an album like this. Like, I mean, I can't really think of another way to start an album like this. Just because,
in the sense that it's obtuse and noisy and weird, and I don't know what the fuck it is still after like 5 listens to this thing. It's like, yeah, this is how I would open this album.
Yeah, exactly. And the way it kind of like it's so atmospheric and dark at the beginning, and Richie is kind of, rapping, and like I really like the kind of the lyrical idea that he's going for, of like, you want to meet in the middle, like you want to see what we have in common, like, and like let's cut all that bullshit. Like it's like in a way it's kind of like confronting the listener, like like we're not going to find like a middle ground between kind of the experimental and accessible stuff. Like this album is going to be, I mean, for lack of a better term, fucked up. It's just going to sound it's,
you get a sense of
and
like
then,
weariness in his voice in terms of like how the band have been pigeonholed. Like I particularly love
Yeah.
that line. The R slash got the white boys talking all
Yeah.
wildly, which is
and and you get it, because I mean, like, that is the kind of hype that they've received, and the sort of like, you know I, I don't often love when bands are like, so confrontational and upfront about like what they're doing with their sound as like a part of an album, instead of like, I think that's something that's better kept exterior, or just you kind of let the aesthetics of your sound do the talking. But here I think it's important, because he means that in every sense, is that he's just sort of like, I'm not going to meet you halfway, of just like, this is going to be raw and unfiltered and honest, and I'm not going to attempt to make art for you. I am attempting to do something for myself, which is kind of the branching off point of what it has in common with something like Iridescence for me, is because that's an album that sort of lures you into a false sense of security by presenting you with things that are the listener is familiar with, and then kind of sucker punching you. Whereas this is no holds barred from the very, very start. They have no intentions other than to be like, this album is what it is, and we're going to be like, not that they say like, oh, we're going to be pushing boundaries, but it's like the degree to which they take their sound is almost like borderline parody levels of like, just pushing what the limitations of what their music is even capable of, to a point where that in itself becomes the sort of artistic statement of the album, and then playing on the expectations of what's expected of them, of just being like, oh, you all went through this, and you all are these like innovative genre sort of like this really interesting crossroads of sonic influences, and we expect you to integrate it in a certain way. And it's sort of them being like, no, we're doing this on our own terms, and I respect that. I think that's a really bold approach here, and I really engage and respond to it.
Yeah, I find it interesting that Reddit reference, because like it neatly touches on the fact that this is a band whose like entire following and the culture surrounding them is obviously deeply imbued within the internet and like online music culture. I mean, it's no surprise this obviously debuted in its first week at the #1 on the Radio Music charts for the year's best albums. This is like a kind of record that encapsulates everything that online music culture specifically thrives off of, and finds the most kind of exciting, and coming from this band that have consistently kind of appealed to that niche of people in this particular way, in a similar sort of vein to Brockhampton. Is it's really interesting. And even if you were to, I don't want to labor on the Brockhampton comp, because I think mentioning it is enough, but if you want to really like dig into the thing, like you could probably really dive into like, why is this record being so rapturously received, but Iridescence was basically universally shed on by those internet people when it came out. And there's some interesting aspects of going deeper beyond just experimentalism into like the ways in which people relate to, or what kind of tragedies, or like in band frictions, or like whatever kind of stuff in the narrative of a band is considered like good, or like meaningful, or like powerful in terms of like how you interpret their subsequent art, versus what is cause for them to be derided or whatever. Like, I don't have a coherent thought here, but like, to me it seems really interesting that I think this is a very comparable record to something like Iridescence, and yet you have this vast ocean of difference in terms of how the two were perceived, and how the two seem to sit in their respective discographies as far as fans are concerned. Like, I don't know. That's not a finished, fully formed
I think
thought.
you're actually onto something there. We've talked about so many albums on this show that I feel like this is like, I don't remember who specifically coined this term. It might have been Mike the Snare. But the sort of idea of the mass exodus album, where, it's the excising of something personal and manifesting it in music. And in that respect, it's like, yeah, you can compare it to Iridescence, but I would also compare it to something like Metallica's And Justice for All, where the sound literally manifests as an absence to reflect the fact that there is someone there who is not there anymore. And I feel like that's 100% here.
Yeah.
It's just that like genre wise, you know, there's not exactly many similar comparisons that you can make like Iridescence, but it's like albums like And Justice for All, where it's sort of that notorious kind of like something shifted.
Yeah, and I think this is
Yeah.
kind of where I get to a point that I've sort of been struggling with, which is that I think that this album being surrounded by tragedy and so thoroughly imbuing elements of experiencing tragedy, whether the tragedy is referred to on this record is the tragedy of Groggs' death or a different kind of tragedy. And I think we should be open to both, considering the timeline of when it was made. But the more time I spend with this record, the more distant I feel from it in a weird way. Like, it's kind of, I still don't really know what to make of it. And I honestly don't know how I feel about it yet. Like, I was really like, as soon as it came out the first time I heard it, I was like, wow, this is like so, you know, nuts and crazy. And I was like, yeah, fuck, this is amazing. But the more time I spend with it, the more I'm like, I don't know. Like, it's just kind of, I think this record has individual moments of utter phenomenal, stunning emotion. And my personal pick for the record's most impressive moment and my favorite Injury Reserve song is actually the track Knees, which to me is I think one of the most powerful songs I've heard
really
all
good.
year.
Yeah,
the absolutely stabbing guitar, which is taken from a Black MIDI song, that is absolutely cutting through this track, and this almost like start-stop odd sort of rhythm is just pounds into your head every time you hear it. And if you watch the music video as well, they have a great visualization of this, and just the general kind of aching pain of this track, of this sense of growing up but not having anything to show for it, of like aging but not gaining anything, of like experiencing and suffering and going through all of this stuff but not really feeling any stronger or any more developed as a result of it, and just feeling like less and less of yourself as you go through it. That's the feeling of the song. And then it's heartbreaking when Groggs eventually does come in onto this track talking about addiction and his struggle with an addiction that he feels he is kind of falling into and sees no real way out of. He tells himself he has to put down the bottle and stuff, but there's no, it's just really gutting and gut-wrenching, and it gets through with a lot of power and directness that I think other parts of the record don't have to the same extent. And that's kind of where I'm struggling with it a little bit, is that it has these really gut punch power moments, and Top Picks for You is another one that absolutely stands out, where I completely am enthralled and utterly taken aback by the sheer rawness of what's on display. And I would throw the opening track into that mix as well, even though it's slightly more bewildering and I don't quite know as much what to make of it. These individual moments are quite stunning. And then you have other tracks that I don't quite know what to make of as much. Like, for instance, the Wild Wild West, which is this utterly strange song where Richie's kind of making allusions to the 5G conspiracy theories. I think it's generally a track about kind of the wasteland of the internet and trying to navigate it as a creative force, but I don't quite have a handle on what Richie's trying to say beyond that, and the repetitive allusions to Willie Smith with the Inspector Gadget just kind of throw me off. But it's a cool enough track. There are other moments on this record though that are equally bewilder me, like Smoke Don't Clear, which has this great again, individual elements that I love. Like, it has this great kind of like distorted, really blown out sound that reminds me of the bit crushed snow crunch sounds on the second track of Wartaker's Chastic Slide of all things.
Wow. Yeah.
And then they're just rapping over top of it. But it seems like, this general sentiment that, it's all uphill from here. We've got a lot of shit to move through. the smoke don't clear, and people might not be taking us seriously. But like, so yeah, I just think there are moments on this record that aren't quite as developed as other moments, and that leaves me in this weird position of struggling to know what to make of it. And I'd be really curious to know what you make of some of these songs and the weird sense of like fragmented nature that they have, where none of them, or very few of them, are really trying to attempt anything approaching a conventional structure, but they almost feel like loose fragments. And I don't quite know what to do with that yet.
I'm actually sort of the opposite of you, Tyler, in this case, because the more I listen to this, the more it all kind of comes together for me. And I think that kind of goes with really any album, especially like albums that are just so layered and detailed as this, where you start to pick up on like the structure, you kind of know what they're, the lyrics, you kind of know like what's going to come the more you listen to it, obviously. But one thing that I kind of thought about was like, I'm assuming a lot of this record was like written last year, but like we said before, Grog's passing, a lot of it I think reflects kind of the darkness of the year that was 2020, especially like a song like Footwork in a Forest Fire, which like,
that's another one of my favorites on this record.
That's fucking awesome.
Yeah, the drum, like that song in particular, I mean, obviously the forest fire was like, forest fires were a pretty like big thing last year. I mean, still are, but like that was one of the things that made 2020 so shit. Well, made now, so you know what I'm saying. But
yes.
But this track, like especially the instrumental and the way the drums are just like doing this, just like whatever drum sample they're using, it's just constantly going, and like the incredibly frantic vocals from Grog's, like it really does sound like, like you're running or doing footwork in a forest fire, like you're trying not to burn your feet off. Like it just has that like fiery quality to it. I think a lot of even though there's, again, like you said, there are some tracks that are kind of hard to like make out what they're about. I think one track that seems to be kind of the least favorite generally, and I totally understand why, because it's a strange and short track, but the song Ground Zero, this song, like it has some allusions, I feel like, or references to the pandemic.
I think you're spot on with those allusions, and I think that they're definitely intended to reference things like that. I mean, even that refrain of "we're at ground zero" with it, like, I mean, you're making a 9/11 reference there, my friend. You're obviously alluding to some kind of unfathomable tragedy, or at least you're wanting to put that image in the listener's head. I guess my perspective is more that I think these are some interesting ideas that I don't know fully cohere into compelling songs at certain points on this record, which I hate to say, because I want to love this record as fully and as deeply as other people do. And there is just, to a certain extent, like I've talked about in the past, there is just, to a certain extent, an appeal in the fragmented nature of art that arises out of tragedy. And this is the reason why I'm conflicted, because I typically like that sort of thing. Like, and I typically can appreciate when the art being fragmented and half formed and broken the way that this record is adds to its impact. But it's weird, like I'm in this weird position where there are certain parts of the record that, if anything, detract from the impact of other parts of it, because it feels like it gets too formless, even for me at certain points. But I recognize that I'm somewhat in the minority there, and so I'll balance that by saying that some of the most genuinely shocking and abrasive moments on this record, and some of the most like barely coherent moments of this record, are also some of my favorites too. I want to shout out Superman, which sounds straight up like a Venetian Snares track. It's utterly fucking ballistic. It's almost like, I love the vocals and the way they interact with this just kind of hammering aggressive electronic drums that are built around a sample of Black Country New Roads, Athens, France, from their album that we reviewed this year. Which I think is interesting that this record has 2 samples from windmill scene post-punk bands, and I want to be able to draw some significance out of that. And I can't, other than to say that Parker Corey has a real penchant for sampling like nerdy, hipstery online culture music that like you had.
They know what they're doing.
On the last record, you had a sample of a Silver Mount Zion's first album, the Godspeed You Black Emperor side project. And you've had he has the real love of these kinds of like, this record also has multiple samples from The Fall, which isn't so much an online culture band, but certainly a band that fit in with the aesthetic of what Injury Reserve are trying to do. You have samples of Shellac and King Crimson on this record as well, which are both really like interesting and bizarre. And the sampling in general is really, really strong. I think particularly you have the most kind of notable, or at least the sample that jumps out the most on this record as being both the most recognizable and the most kind of like integral to what the song is, being the sample of Brian Eno's Here Come the Warm Jets on the closing track of this album, By Storm. That song is literally just the Robert Fripp played guitar riff from that song with some rapping over top of it, and it's chopped up a bit. And that's, like, I remember the first time I heard that, I was like, whoa, okay, that's Robert Fripp in my ear right now. So you have King Crimson and a Robert Fripp played guitar line from a Brian Eno record on this album as well. And so, yeah, these are kind of like interesting details. I guess I don't have a wider picture for their significance, but yeah, I mean, to me, this is just a record of fragments, and like those samples, fragments of moments that really shock me, startle me, grab me emotionally, where I go like, oh, that's a really fantastic drum sound, or really weird industrial quirk, or strange lyrical motif, or really creatively integrated sample. Like I have so many of these individual moments where I think these things, and then I have an equal number of moments, or maybe not an equal number of moments. I think there's definitely more moments where I think these positive things, but there are also other moments where I think, okay, but like, what is this cohering into? Like for example, the track I love instrumentally, which is SS San Francisco, which is built around another Fall sample. But then I don't particularly like Z Loopers, who is in the Bruiser Brigade, has a feature on the song that I felt was pretty underwhelming, to be honest. And I couldn't really understand what he was trying to add to the song. He mentions toaster strudel, okay, dude, whatever. So yeah, there's like, and then Richie's kind of a little bit, I still have no idea what he's talking about in the song either. So maybe it's just the fact that I haven't unlocked it yet, but I'm slightly frustrated that I can't fully get in love with this the way that everyone else seems to be. But the moments that I do fully love, and that's whether they're full songs like Outside and Superman That and Top Picks for You and Knees, whether they're full songs or whether they're individual moments within other tracks, like the general sound of footwork in a forest fire. And I also probably relevant to mention that I think they were recording in California, I think, when the forest fires were happening there. And this record was kind of like inspired by both inspired by a performance or a remix of Isaac Hayes' version of the classic song By the Time We Get to Phoenix, but also the band's returning home to Arizona, where they're from, as well. So there's little allusions to that baked in here as well. But the thing that gets me is that I feel like certain aspects of certain songs in this record, like the sheer chaos of Wild Wild West and the weird allusions to the 5G conspiracy theories and the weird descriptions, like, feel completely at odds with the potency and power of other parts of this record. And I find it difficult to reconcile the ways in which these songs kind of give me whiplash from track to track. And also there are just parts of it that I just do find genuinely irritating. I hate to say that, but Richie's vocal on Smoke Don't Clear, where he's like, oh man, which one of you left the door open? You gonna let that shit all in? Like that voice he does. Yeah. It just,
Weird.
I don't
I think
get
it's cool.
it.
No, I like that's the thing though, is that like I like in a lot of instances that I agree with you, and it's like I think that again, that's where I'm at in a weird place of just like I recognize that I think they are deliberately being like, we are just putting some shit in here just because it is chaotic, and because like the fact that it is diametrically opposed to those emotional moments feels like the intent. And at like on the one hand, it's like they said, they're not attempting to meet people halfway, and this is genuinely how I think they're trying to manifest it. That said, it's just like I think you did that, but also as a listener, I don't enjoy some select parts of it. And it's like, on again, you're sort of just trying to like, it's the oh, we've covered an album like or at least within this like year-long span where I had the same. Actually, no, you know what? An album that I can't believe I didn't bring up until this point is that it reminds me of fucking Amnesiac, where the parts of it that are confrontational and weird and don't fit with the rest of the album, where it's just like, yeah, I understand why you did this, and I think you did it, but also I don't know how to feel about it. Like, there's just parts where you're like, is this because the band is trying to do something specific, or is this because the band didn't really know how to fully realize the mood they were going for? And again, this is only like, my thoughts are still like, I really love this album, but I love it at a distance. I love it at a distance in the same way that I love the Julian Baker album from this year, and that I find it almost so oppressively and overwhelmingly dark and bleak, in that I don't know how many more times I'm going to listen to it, frankly. But I find it fascinating to look into as a musical art piece almost more than I like it as an album. And I know that sounds pretentious as fuck, but
Yeah.
I don't think that you can engage with this in the traditional way you would an Injury Reserve album. And I think that's
Sure.
made apparent by everything.
Yeah, I think if I'm just gonna encapsulate it one more, because I don't want to harp on my you know, weird difficulty with this record any longer, but there are moments this record that are committed to this real darkness and this emotional rawness that I love. But there are moments where it feels like you're taken out of that, like Wild Wild West and Smoke Don't Clear, where like that voice that I made fun of, like the reason I don't like that is because it's like it weirdly takes me out of the emotional space that I was in beforehand, because it's just kind of so silly. And I'm not saying that Injury Reserve can't have a sense of humor on their really dark, weird album, but there's this kind of fritziness to its emotional tonality that songs like Top Picks for You and Knees, to me, like hit so much harder in isolation when I just put them on than when they do in the context of this record, because I'm just like, I'm barely able to process them.
I mean, I obviously really love this album. Probably the most out of you all, because I mean, I totally understand the complaints, but I don't know, for me, like it's just, even the lesser tracks, it's just a thoroughly exciting and engaging album.
Yeah,
for me,
definitely.
that like I can forgive some of the parts, like what Tyler said, the weird voice on Smoke Don't Clear. You know, I listen to that and I'm like, it is weird, but I can't say I don't enjoy it, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
But
yeah, same.
yeah. I actually, funny thing, I wrote in my notes specifically about Wild Wild West, that with the like random kind of changes in the low and the high, like pitched vocals, it sounds almost like a really, really fucked up Marc Rebier song. If you know who that is, that's the loop guy.
Wow.
But that's certainly a weird comparison for this album. But
I was thinking no one on earth, I think, would have made that comparison, but I still see where you're coming from, so that's good.
Yeah. Particularly, I mean, just go through some of the things that I really love about it. Like, I like you all, I absolutely love Superman. That I think it's easily one of the best songs that they've ever made. One thing I really appreciate about it is that, yeah, it's so like what's the word, overwhelming, and just pounds you over the head with the glitchy drums and that crazy sample. But like if you listen closely, especially to like the bass line and stuff, and also like just kind of what Richie's singing over it, it's actually like it's really melodic. Like, and you wouldn't get that on first listen just because you're just so overwhelmed by what's happening. But the more you listen to it, it's like, this is actually kind of catchy. Like it has like a pretty standard chord progression, which I didn't realize until like 4 listens into it. I wasn't huge on SS San Francisco when I first heard it, but the more I listen to it, the more, again, it kind of comes together for me. I love the like grimy bass line.
Yeah, that's that full sample. It's a great sample.
Oh, right.
It's really well used. It's very like, again, like actually now that I think about it, there's a lot of like post-punk sampling on this record in general, to the point where it almost feels closer to industrial post-punk than hip-hop.
It does, especially on like the ending of Outside, for example. It straight up sounds like krautrock or something.
Yeah.
I haven't heard much krautrock, but I assume that's what it kind of sounds like.
I get what you're saying.
I'm not the most, but yeah, like on SS San Francisco, I love the way Richie flows on that song, like kind of dragging behind the beat with this awe and putting weird emphasis on each line. It gives the track like a real sense of weight and almost sludginess. Well, one thing that I've noticed about this album is that it's surprisingly like kind of bluesy. Like there's a lot of like psychedelic rock and blues rock influence, and I hear that on like SS San Francisco, Smoke Don't Clear, and other tracks. Top Picks for You, I think, is my favorite song on this album. Probably my favorite song that they've ever made. It's just absolutely crushing. Funny thing is, I first listened to this album while I was at the gym, and it was like really late. So, I mean, there was only like one other person there. But like when he said certain lines, like, as I drove through, I still see pieces on the street of glass, still immortalized from things that happened, turned to fragments, then a figment I could only imagine, turned to ashes in the blink of an eye. I could hold you, or I could hold in a basket, but your pattern's still intact and algorithms still reacting. And the way he like emphasizes that pattern and algorithm line, I was just like, bro, I'm at the gym. I don't want to cry right now. Like, come on.
Yeah.
It just hits so hard.
I didn't really mention it, but that song is a really great song about, in terms of like being a song about grieving someone in a very unique way, because it's a song about what they leave behind, and specifically grief in this particular age where your all the data that you give as a human being is absorbed by the computers and the machines and stuff, and is used to kind of feed back at you potential like recommendations and things like on Spotify or whatever, ways to live your life. And the fact that, you know, when we become aware of your death, those sorts of things still continue and go on, and it's another kind of grieving to deal with them when they remain. And it's like they function metaphorically as a ghost, and I think that is what the "he looks just like you" refrain in the bridge refers to.
I was just going to mention that. It's kind of an inversion of like there's lots of like when it's, especially in music, a lot of people sort of try and they kind of find solace in ideas like that. You know, it's like, oh, you know, the work you did will live on, and we can cherish like stuff that you're still inside. And this kind of inverts it in a way that shows you that that's a little bit more complicated, and that, like, you know, the look across the table, I see a lot more than what appears to be a shadow. He walks across the room, I see a lot more than seem to be patterns. It's like he's describing a ghost being manifested from all of these images, but feeling like an uncanniness and a separation from that it's like, this is different. This is not the person that I knew. And that's so startling and confronting and like difficult to process. The first time I heard it, I was just kind of like, Jesus fucking Christ, dude, fuck.
And that's when you get back to Knees, where he basically, not directly but indirectly, kind of foresees his own death in a certain extent, because he raps very kind of hopelessly about, you know, how absolutely in the throes of an alcohol addiction that he is, and how, people are genuinely concerned about him, and how he, does that consistent addict thing of telling himself it's going to be the last time, and then acknowledging in the song that it won't be. So there's a certain extent that where there's a futility and a hopelessness in his words on this song that utterly undoes me. And yeah, I mean, this was the lead single for the record as well, so it was the first taste of this whole album that I heard. And to hear him come in and his voice from beyond the grave to come in and talk about this pain and this hopelessness of the state that he's in is just really difficult.
If you listen to like past Injury Reserve albums and stuff, alcohol, like his issues with alcoholism is like a reoccurring theme that like it comes up. So yeah, it's a heartbreaking song. And it kind of goes into like, to me, the last 3 tracks on this album are kind of where the album comes full circle in a way. Because like, with the exception of maybe like Top Picks for You, the whole album has just been sounding absolutely like fucked up and alien sounding pretty much. But then like the last 3 tracks come in and it sounds a lot more human in a way. Like the song like Postpartum, which we haven't really mentioned.
Love that song.
Yes, like the beat is amazing. It kind of reminds me of like an old Kanye sort of beat in a way. It just has
like acid
a fantastic
jazz soundtrack.
Yeah, it has a great like melodic refrain, and I think like I said, Outside is the perfect opener. I think By Storm is the perfect closer. Tyler said obviously it has the Brian Eno sample, and that's like, at least without prior knowledge, it's like I feel like it's the only truly recognizable sample used on this album, unless you're really good at like picking up on samples and stuff. But like, it's not really, from my understanding, it's not really altered much, but it gives like, and it's very like melodic and beautiful, which contrasts like a lot of the stuff that came prior to it. Like one of the reoccurring lines, like one of the lines in the beginning is saying like the show must go on and stuff. Like a reluctant acceptance at the end of the record, like the acceptance stage. I also see this in the album cover, where the album cover looks like super dark and apocalyptic with this shade of red that just it kind of looks like what we saw with like forest fires and stuff, but like on the individual's head is replaced with this glimmer of light. And to me, like By Storm is kind of like that glimmer of light. It's just it's a really beautiful way to end the record, I think. Yeah,
reminds me a lot of Earl Sweatshirt's some rap songs. This song specifically, it's just got that exact same mood. A lot of this album does, in fact, actually, now that more that I think about it, those last 3 tracks in specific. But yeah.
Well, let's move into our favorite tracks and ratings then. Jake, why don't you go first?
This is a frustrating fucker of an album. It's probably going to be difficult to glean just because I've been so like weirdly like heavily on criticism, but also saying that I love it. And well, congratulations, this is the kind of album that invokes that kind of disparity. But this is just subject to change. But like, I also don't know how much more I want to listen to this. But as of right now, my 3 favorite tracks are definitely Top Picks for You. I'm going to shout out Knees as well. And I want to say Superman That, but since that's a track that's gotten a lot of love, I'm going to say that I really am a really big fan of the instrumental on Postpartum. That's the track that I really, really love getting to. And least favorite is definitely Wild Wild West. It's the point on the album of which the confrontational nature of its construction is the least effective to me. On other points, I think it might work, but here doesn't really do much for me. And right now, I'm going to give the album an 8.5.
Okay. August and Morgan are obviously not with us this week, but they have listened to the record and they've both given it an 8.
Wow.
Hell yeah.
The rare August 8.
Indeed. My 3 favorite tracks are Knees, absolutely hands down my favorite track, followed closely by Top Picks for You, and I'll put Footwork in a Forest Fire as my 3rd favorite track. Least favorite track is probably Wild Wild West, and I'm going to give it a 7. At this stage anyway. It feels not dissimilar to the first time I did hear Earl Sweatshirt's Some Rap Songs, where I kind of didn't really know what to do with it. And then eventually I came around. By the time we reviewed it, I was completely in love with it. And so more or less anyway. So yeah, so that could happen with this, although I have listened to this record like 5 times now. So I feel reasonably confident about how I feel. But who knows? It's the kind of record where you definitely have to give it the benefit of the doubt if you're not fully there the whole way through. But that's something you should do with all music. But I think I'm trying to do that here, but also not trying to just say it's amazing. I have no idea why, but it is, because I don't feel that way. But it's a special record, and I'm glad it's getting them the accolades that they deserve. And it's no surprise to me that it's as big and beloved as it is. And I think it's quite cool that internet culture embraces records like these, where you might not necessarily know what on earth you're going to do with it the first time you hear it, but you do give it the benefit of the doubt. I think it's better than just shutting stuff like this out for its incomprehensibility. In fact, that's a weird aspect, not to tangent, and I'll keep this brief, but that's a weird aspect of how like music culture has changed, where like, at least in my perception anyway, where like 30, 40 years ago, stuff that you'd be inclined to do the exact opposite. You'd be inclined to not give really weird, strange records.
We talked about Star Sailor, that's an album where that exact same thing happened with. And I mean, like, isn't it funny that the 2 top rated albums this year are this and Little Sims, which are as apart from each other as something as wide of an umbrella term as hip hop can even be? It's like you have Little Sims, which is like, a great record, but it's very much like, this is definitely a contemporary hip hop album that sounds like a lot of the sounds here, sounds that are typical of the genre that are executed well. And then you have this, which is like,
Anyway, Connor, what's your favorite tracks and rating?
So my 3 favorite tracks would be Top Picks for You. It's hard to pick 3 on here. I'd probably go with Superman That, and then either By Storm or Knees. I don't know. I'll go with By Storm just to make it a little more diverse, I guess.
Effective 1-2 punch.
Yeah. Least favorite, I love every track, but I'd probably go with Wild Wild West. And I'm going to go ahead and give this a big old 9.5.
Ooh, that's juicy.
Powerful.
Love it.
I'd say it's probably my 2nd favorite album of the year right now.
Beautiful.
I simply think we should stop referencing Barry Sonnenfeld films. Well,
that gives us an average rating of 8.2, which I'm not going to go through all the records that share that rating, although one that does feel relevant is this year's Backwash album, which is also an experimental hip-hop record that we have at the same exact rating. So, good year for that general mold of music, and good year for music that defies easy classification as well, which I'm a big fan of. Anyway, let's move on then to our second review of the day, which is the podcast's principal Thrice expert is Morgan, who sadly is not with us this week. However, in his stead, we do, of course, have Connor, who, if you watched the whole episode, if you were watching our What We've Been Listening To segment, you'll know that Connor has been a big fan of Thrice for a long time, particularly their early records, and took a great amount of time this week to revisit all of them and prepare for this review. So, Connor, why don't you talk about, obviously you've talked about your feelings on those earlier records, and Jake as well, but why don't you talk about the more, I guess, contemporary post-hardcore era of Thrice's sound, this more alternative rock era, I guess, and what the records have been like in that mold, and then how this record fits in that mold, and you can probably go into your thoughts if you want, and we'll build from there.
Yeah, so obviously Thrice, legendary 2000s post-hardcore band from California. Of course, like Tyler mentioned, I absolutely adore their earlier stuff, especially that 3-album run of The Illusion of Safety, The Artist in the Ambulance, and Visu. Of course, Visu, though, is pretty much the turning point of their career. You could compare it to an album like, well, typical comparison, but like OK Computer or something, to where they go from kind of, I don't want to say like because they weren't really that standard before Visu, but it was like just really good post-hardcore with incredible musicianship and really interesting songwriting. But Visu is where they just experimented with so many different styles of music and like production styles as well. And then when you go into Beggars is, like I mentioned earlier, that's kind of where they push back a bit on the hardcore sound of their earlier days. It's not a record that I would call hardcore at all, but
no,
it certainly has like elements of like post rock as well as, you know, alternative rock and stuff. And then when you get into the 2010s, you get to 2011, which I just realized this album's actually, this album just turned 10 years old 4 days ago, Major Minor.
This podcast sure does do that a lot.
It really does. And that record is amazing, even though it's one of their I wouldn't say it's one of their more ambitious in terms of like diverse, like sonically. It just
fundamentals
rips.
though.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It takes the fundamentals of like their sound and just like really emphasizes that. Just amazing guitar tones, amazing like songwriting ideas. But then after that, the band went on hiatus and didn't come back until 2016's To Be Everywhere Is To Be Nowhere, which is a great comeback album for the band, even though it's only 5 years in between. Personally, it's not one of my absolute favorites from them, but it does kind of take a more, and I mean, I use this term lightly, but like radio friendly approach. But
I would say so.
Yeah, radio friendly, but like still with a lot of really great songwriting and some of their biggest songs to date, especially the song Black Honey, which just became
a terrific track.
Yeah, and that became like a radio, like at the time it was basically like a radio rock staple. And yeah, so that's a great record, even though at points sonically it does get a little bit I guess tame for my taste. But then we get into the album Palms after they signed with Epitaph Records. And like I said earlier, this is the first time I had heard this record. And yeah, it's got good elements to it for sure. But overall, the production is kind of flat. The songwriting just does not hit near as hard as it did before. So that kind of leaves Thrice at a weird position because Palms, I mean, if you look at kind of like, you know, scores and stuff, but also like fan discourse, Palms is definitely, aside from their debut Identity Crisis, Palms is probably their least well-received album. So that kind of leaves the band at a weird position. Like, are they going to continue doing stuff like this? Or are they going to evolve? Or are they going to make an absolute killer of a record, kind of like Deftones did after Gore?
Yeah.
So now we have the new album, Horizons East. And as suspected, this band, like, all their albums sound different and unique to each other. So I think this album is good. I think it's an improvement on Palms for sure. It takes their sound in a lot more, like, even more experimental approach than they were on Palms. And I like it. but I can't say I really like it. I don't think it's I don't think it's a huge step up from Palms, but I think it's a step in the right direction from that record, because there's certainly a lot more interesting and enjoyable stuff going on here. The first example for me being the opening track, The Color of the Sky.
Easily the best thing here.
Agree.
I was
Agree.
Oh,
love that song.
That's 3 votes for the best track. We already know what it is.
I'm so glad that was uniform.
Yeah, like this track just does a great job of opening the song, or opening this album. I love the they don't use synths all that often, but I love the way the synth is kind of opens this track, and he kind of sings quietly over it, and then the drums fade in, and that drum beat is fantastic. I just love how the song just drives throughout, and all the layers of arpeggiated synth and then pads towards the end too just really add a lot to the atmosphere and the intensity of this opener. It's a great song.
Absolutely. Because I listened to this, when I listened to this for the first time, the only other Thrice record I had heard was Visu, and I since went back and listened to additional records to try and give myself fuller context. But the thing is with me and Thrice is that I just can't. It's the most consistently 7 out of 10 band for me, and I just wish I could find that thing that I wish I could connect with them in the way. It's just like, it's
what
so aggravating.
To thus far,
so I went back and listened to Artists in the Ambulance, which I feel about the same as Visu on, which I think is pretty good. I think Visu I probably
it's amazing, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. And then I went yesterday. I went yesterday and listened to Beggars, and I was like, okay, I can tell from Horizons East that they've headed in this more what I would term alt rock direction. And that is interesting. And I am in war with it on concept, but I would like to see them do it a bit more better. And not Horizons, Beggars is definitely a better record than this one, but still I'm at this weird distance where I don't love it the way I was hoping I would. But that all said, just that's a tangent. The opening track, Color of the Sky, on this record, when I first heard this, I was like, oh shit, this is actually quite interesting. And I love the just generally unexpected sound and tone that it has, even if I knew that this was an alt rock band at this point in this juncture in time. August as well shares our feelings on this song as well. He gave some brief notes and says that he really likes the synthetic percussion and there's generally like really entrancing sound the song has. I was like, fuck yes, I'm here, let's go, this is actually like my kind of shit. And then you go straight into Scavengers, the next song, and it's like, my god, this is the most boilerplate fucking like, holy shit, this is algorithms writing alt rock songs. And the thing is that you can tell consistently throughout this record that Thrice are a band that have talented musicians in it. Like that drummer, Connor, you mentioned the drumming on the opening track. That immediately doubted me as well. And I think across this record, the performances in general, and including the drumming, but not limited to it, there's genuine kind of, weight to all of the instrumentation on this record. And it's produced reasonably well, I would say as well. Like a lot of these kinds of alt rock records that we like to kind of rag on, one of the big aspects is they usually sound like dog shit, and this does sound like, it doesn't sound like dog shit. It sounds pretty good, and I think that the best moments are produced really, really well. But yeah, I just couldn't get past how utterly bland these songs were, and I don't have that reference point of their last few records post Beggars as a quality comparison point either. So that's kind of where I'm at broadly.
I'm curious as to what you would think of an album like Major Minor.
I'm still willing, it's been consistent now, like 1, 2, 3, 4 Thrice records that I've all given somewhere between a 6.5 and a 7.5. And I'm like,
I really want to recommend the Alchemy Index EPs, because I really feel like if any of these albums are going to connect with you, it's going to be those. They're the most forwardly like adventurous things that they've made. So I hope that maybe will be something that you could latch onto.
I hope so. I do. I just like the even the post-hardcore sound, like on records like Artist in the Ambulance and Visu, like it goes straight through me. Like it doesn't linger with me the way that bands like
No.
I know, I hate
Stop.
it. I hate it. Although the songwriting is pretty fucking great on those records and there's great riffs and stuff, but just generally it doesn't like cut through to me. But anyway, that's a whole different thing. This record, I think some of the riffs, not to commandeer, I'm just kind of like giving assorted thoughts, but some of the riffs are really good. The vocal performances generally are pretty strong, although there are some definite exceptions to that. And I mean, we have to talk about the third song on this record.
Okay,
I was
thank
gonna
you.
say,
okay,
I was gonna say.
I was like, I don't know where anybody stands here, but Buried in the Sun is easily one of my least favorite Thrice songs for like a plethora of reasons. So
it's straight up one of the worst songs.
Can we talk about the? It's the DOD or the CIA line, just absolutely fucking like I'm gonna. This album, I feel like, as Tyler and Connor have both like sort of led with what they think broadly about the album, is that I basically completely agree. Like I'm definitely a little bit less hot than Connor, but like I'm still willing to acknowledge that it does have some interesting things and some good songs. That said, Buried in the Sun is inexplicable because the first two songs here, at least for me anyway, like I kind of thought that they were going to do a narrative thing, because Thrice is not a stranger to doing stories within their albums and within their songs, because The Color of the Sky is clearly a song that is about someone who is like, you know, he's trapped within a specific world, and then he gains like some sort of clarity that allows him to see like, you know, color and whatnot, and then escapes and like goes somewhere. And then Scavengers is a song of him then like, you know, like leaving and exploring like a new place. And then Buried in the Sun just comes along and steamrolls the fucking album and then talks about the DOD and the CIA in the first fucking line, and you're just like, wait, what? Where is this coming from? And he's like screaming it, but his screams are like, they're processed kind of weird. It sounds like he's like recording from like behind a wall or something, and he's saying shit like 2468 USA, all right, the blood red, the black gold, this is the air we breathe.
Like,
it's
you know what this reminds me of, because clearly I get it, they're trying to do some kind of like mocking, sarcastic American commentary. It reminds me of that fucking Lamb of God song on the last Lamb of God album that we reviewed, where it was like, you know, this is the new abnormal, make America hate again, or whatever they said on that record.
And the thing that kills me about this song, though, is that I feel like maybe Connor will back me up here, is that like this is not the only time Thrice have aimed at being like modern or political. On an album like To Be Everywhere is to Be Nowhere, they had a song like Blood on the Sand, which is a great song that's about them taking a stance against drone strikes in the Middle East. And it's like, you know, politics and lyricism aside, even though I think they're good, the song just rips. Here, the song decidedly doesn't. Yeah, and here there also is just like the lyricism here. It's not even, parts of it isn't even bad. It just gets to points where I'm like, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, she felt the thrum of the helicopter, a little taste of the shock and awe. She tried to run, but the bullets caught her, courtesy of our coup d'etat. Like, it's just, what are you talking about, Dustin?
I get exactly what it's talking about. Like, it's talking about like, you know, US interference in the Middle East and like murder and stuff. It's just way too blunt and just not very compelling lyrically. Like, it's
also disparate. Like, there's these ideas that are in the same verse, and it's like you're presenting me with like these three different things within like just a couple of lines, and I'm like, man, you got to stick to an idea to make your point across. Otherwise, this comes off as being hackneyed, and it feels really fucking hackneyed.
Yeah, I mean, if we're the cops, then the world is our prison. It's just like such a fucking like tears in my diary bullshit. That's
like
line.
They were just like, oh, like they listened to like the like Prison Song by System of a Down, and they were just like, oh, we can do that, and then they didn't have Serge Tankian to write and perform it.
Yeah, but look,
and this is what we get.
So, like, as someone who, you know, this whole past week, of course, I already mentioned many times that I went through Thrice's whole discography, And Jake, you said this has got to be one of their worst songs. This is their worst song. I haven't found a song.
Yeah, okay.
Song
I was being a bit more generous because like maybe I didn't remember something.
I know, yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
but out of all the songs, like this is the one I was like, what are they doing? And there's also like things about the music, like the way it's written. I really don't care for. Like you said, the distant yells, the chorus, I do not like at all. Like the way they kind of layered the vocals, it just sounds weird and artificial. And another thing,
even the way Dustin says it is a little,
yeah,
it's a little stilted.
Exactly.
I don't really like it.
Yeah, and when you have like angry or sarcastic, like political songs like this, like explicitly political, like I want to be as pissed as you are.
Yes.
But when a song is like just this bland, and like there's even like a climax in it, because I wrote in my notes like that there's a climax in it, but I also wrote that it doesn't go hard enough because I don't remember it. I don't remember it at all. Like when you listen to a song, like you listen to Prison Song, for example, when I hear that, and he's like, they're trying to build a prison, I'm like just headbanging. I'm like, yeah. Like fuck those guys.
Trying to build a prison.
I'm pissed. But like I listen to this and I'm just like,
okay.
Yeah, I guess you're right. Whatever. It's just, not a fan.
Like
of
I
that
too have
song
been
at
on
all.
Twitter.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, that's probably enough ragging on that song.
Well, it's because it's one of the few points of like I didn't get into like broader, but like it's because it's one of the few truly interesting points on the album, which broadly it's just kind of not.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I think that the competency of the performances and some of the, the general commitment is enough to overcome the blandness of composition and writing on the rest of this record, such that I wouldn't call this record, I call it fine. It's decent as opposed to like totally mediocre, in my opinion. Like, I do think there are some stronger moments. Like, I actually think that the record picks up reasonably well towards the midsection, right after that song with Northern Lights, and especially Summer Set Fire to the Rain, which, is a fantastic Adele cover. But
I'm glad that was such a
feeling.
Strange thing. I was sitting there listening to it and I was just like, am I going to start hearing him be like Dustin covering Adele? Because like, I mean, I'm not going to say no, but
yeah. And I mean, look, and the great, how the hard hitting feeling of that song is enough like to overcome the fact that the lyrics are really quite sort of anodyne and, very poetic in a way that feels very kind of like mawkish and, the summer set fire to the rain and fire to my bones, but you just stood there begging for the world to leave you alone. And it's very like, and it's got a refrain of how long until the bloom. And it's like, but that I don't care when the song has this real genuine hard-hitting feeling to it. And August says the same thing as well. This is another highlight in his opinion. The real muscle that this song has compositionally can overcome some of those limitations. Whereas in the case of tracks later in the record, like, I mean, pick one out of a hat, Robot Soft Exorcism, let's say. There's just, there's very little happening there that stands out and has a punch to it. And it's a real shame.
One of the few songs I've heard in recent memory that I don't care for, but it's in 7/4.
Oh,
and
I
love me some 7/4. So you know how disappointed I am by that.
Yeah.
But yeah, like going back to like the second track, you said is Scavengers is kind of boilerplate, and I agree. I don't think it's a great song, but I do think it's one of the better songs here. Some of the like down-tuned guitar and like grimy bass actually kind of reminds me of something that Deftones would do, but it of course it doesn't like, it doesn't hit as hard as Deftones, obviously. And it makes sense because these guys are actually it even says on Wikipedia here that they're greatly influenced by Deftones. But yeah, and like Northern Lights is another track that I think is pretty cool. I like the kind of beginning, like with the drums. I really love the guitar lead at the very beginning of that song. It's almost jazzy in a way.
Yeah, it is.
And I like even though I do enjoy the addition of the piano chords, it's kind of a cool texture. I don't like the way they're mixed. They sound like thin. It's not like ultimately satisfying. Summer Set Fire to the Rain, I agree, is one of the highlights here. It actually, to me, this song sounds most like something that would be on To Be Everywhere is To Be Nowhere than anything else on the album. And I'll be honest, I don't listen to Thrice for the lyrics primarily. Not to say that they're not bad lyricists, obviously, but like there's just, when I read through some of the lyrics on this album, it just, some of the imagery just comes off as cliche. And
no, 100%. Like as somebody who does listen to Thrice for the lyrics, and I love like the narratives and stories that they tell, that's actually, I think, the biggest problem I have with the album is that whenever they do get relatively ambitious with storytelling, or they just kind of attempt it on this album, it's not interesting. And frankly, a lot of it, like, you know, like they try to do the political bent on Buried in the Sun, but they also like there's definitely like a sense of them trying to take a greater stab at, like, you know, the modern world or whatever, and it always comes off as being really shallow and really surface level. And the music just, you know, it's like you're saying, it doesn't have the impact to support those kind of lyrics. And I'm like, I want the Thrice that came with like Visu, where it's like these songs aren't just songs, they're stories and they build something. And I'm like, you all have done this before. I know you can do it again.
Yeah, that's where I think their lyricism and their storytelling is strongest, especially on a song like I mentioned earlier, Daedalus, which is just so like basically just, yeah, exactly. Like a song that is pretty much just kind of like retelling the story of Icarus flying too close to the sun, but the way it's presented is just so impactful and so emotional. You really like feel it. Whereas this is just, it's just, and another thing is like these songs just don't like the way they're written and the way like these choruses and like melodies are written, they just don't have the impact that they did on other albums, like even like Major Minor. A song like The Dreamer, for example, that song just has like a totally forgettable hook. I just remember that it's forgettable. Yeah, even though I do kind of like the intro guitar chords to a song like that. It kind of reminds me of the band Hum, which I love.
Oh yeah, I hear what you're saying. No, I basically feel about the same. I think that the record kind of slumps into a mode in its second half of just, you know, decent riffage. And again, I'll give credit to the vocal performances, which are generally pretty strong in the second half of the record as well. Ends a bit on a bit of a kind of ho-hum instrumental note with the closing track, which doesn't leave much of an impression. Although I will say that I quite enjoy the song Dandelion Wine, and purely because
that's good. That's a highlight.
It has a nice energy to the vocal performance and the way that he really, like, you know, hangs on those words when he sings them, and the band are quite intense. It feels like the record reaches a kind of swell there in terms of its climactic finish that I think is pretty good. So that's basically where I'm at.
I thought like that song specifically, Dandelion Wine, to me, I just found it a little just unremarkable, but that was up until that climax at the end, which is one of the best moments on this record, I think. But that's kind of one of my issues with this album, is that there's a lot of like really great moments. There's a lot of really great like individual stuff. And of course, like one thing that's consistent with all their albums is just the great musicianship. Like Eddie Breckenridge is a killer bassist, and this album shows that. I mean, all their albums show that. Like just amazing tone, really like locked in with the drums. Like all the elements of a great record, I think, are here, but they just don't come together into these super memorable songs. And I also, one of my big complaints, and Tyler, you said like the overall production and mixing is good, and I agree, but it's just a little too clean for my taste. I prefer kind of their more raw sounds of albums like the Artist in the Ambulance, or even a
Yeah.
Major Minor, which is produced fantastically.
I will say
the drums sound amazing. But
I appreciated the cleanness at certain points. Like, I think it gave
Yeah.
a lot of weight to the songs I like, but also there's when the record isn't sounding particularly inspired, it kind of comes across like, I'm sure there's a better comparison than this, but like it's a little like Imagine Dragons-y in some of the blander moments.
I get what you mean, unfortunately.
So, I'm sure there's probably like, I don't know, another blander, less outright horrible alt rock band to make a comparison to there, but that's just in the weakest moments anyway. I will make sure that I endeavor to check out Major Minor, because at this point I want more than anything to really love a Thrice record. So it might be that, or Alchemy Index, or maybe one of the other records like will grow on me. Who knows?
Yeah, Major Minor is like, I'm not certain that you'll love that record. I can't like guarantee it. That's the thing with any recommendation really, but it's just an album that like takes like a lot of their most basic qualities and just really excels at them. It doesn't, like this album, Horizons East, this album like goes for a lot of ambitious ideas, but kind of falls flat at a lot of those. Whereas that album, I feel like is a bit more straightforward, but it really excels at those individual aspects, like amazing guitar sound, amazing riffs. The songs are memorable.
Awesome.
So yeah, I feel like I've been reviewing Major Minor instead of this new album.
Well, isn't that kind of the point?
We've basically, I think, said that most of what needs to be said, if everything.
Well, I will say, as somebody who's invested in the trajectory of Thrice, I am mildly worried, just because, like, while I will totally stand up for records like To Be Everywhere Is to Be Nowhere, I will say that, like, it's definitely them taking their sound in a direction that I find less overall interesting, which is why, at least, like, Connor, you kind of got at it a little bit, is that these last two records, which I think are pretty uniformly considered to be the band's weakest, I have a little bit of faith that, like, maybe they can come through with something, because it's like Palms is like, I don't really think anything on that album is interesting, but they execute it in about as well as could be expected. But on here, I feel like there's a lot of interesting ideas. They just don't really execute any of them well. So they have like complete opposite problems.
Yeah, like I want a record that sounds like, I want a whole record that sounds like Color of the Sky, for instance. And I was really excited when I first heard that. And then nothing else on the album sounds like it.
I would love to see them get that adventurous and that competent, even though, like, is it just fucking me, or like, I still think the song's the best on the album, but The Color of the Sky, that's just Bloom from The King of Limbs. It's got like the same cycling percussion, the way it builds, it's the same song.
Holy shit. I'll have to go back and listen to it with that in mind. Fuck me.
There's also a song in the second half here, and I can't remember it because of course I don't remember a song on here, but there's a song in the second half where I'm just like, this is just No Surprises, but like in a different key. But like but I really just want them to be able to come out with something with a little bit more of an identity, because the problem with Thrice is that, for as much as I like them as a band, is that, like, they're just at the very center of rock music, in the sense that, like, you kind of made that Imagine Dragons comparison, and while it's obviously not that severe, the problem is that they're just sort of like hovering around a lot of very basic sounding rock sounds. Like, they're influenced by so many genres that they kind of run the risk of being influenced a little bit by all of them, but not really coming through with an identity of their own, even though they had perfected that, at least in my opinion, on stuff like Visu. So I want them to be able to flesh out their ideas in a way that, like, they're not trying to do this whole mono genre thing. And this at least proves to me that they're willing to be a little bit riskier. So I have a little bit of faith, but I'm still a little bit worried about the trajectory of this band. And even if they continue to make music, because they've been doing it for a long fucking time now, who knows when they'll stop.
Yeah
It's like, regarding like the Radiohead comparisons, which, by the way, this is far from the first time that they've been compared to Radiohead.
Oh yeah,
like especially within their like career trajectory. actually the last song on this album kind of reminded me a little bit of the last song off Moonshape, True Love Waits, just with like the kind of randomized piano, like arpeggios that are just kind of circling the mix a bit. But the problem with this song, problem with this song is that it just feels directionless. It just kind of, the album ends on a whimper, I feel like, instead of a extreme emotional note like a Moonshaped Pool.
And not a literal Tom York whimper.
Yeah, exactly. It's just, it's just overall kind of underwhelming. Still, I will say, kind of been talking about issues with this album. I still generally like it, but very like minimally enjoy.
Fair enough.
Yeah, it's far from a bad record.
Yeah, for sure.
Alrighty, well then let's do our favorite tracks and ratings, and we'll go in reverse order just for fun. Connor, why don't you go first?
Favorite track, the Sky 3 times. No, just kidding. Second would be Summer Set Fire to the Rain, and then third would be Northern Lights. Least favorite, I mean, Buried in the Sun, of course. And I'm going to give this a 6 out of 10.
Okay. My 3 favorite tracks are obviously The Color of the Sky, Summer Set Fire to the Rain, and Dandelion Wine. My least favorite track is Let Me Go On Like I'm Buried in the Sun, by the Violent Femmes. No,
that took me a second.
Anyway,
I want a post-hardcore interpolation of that riff, man.
Yeah, totally. I mean, come on. I'm giving the album a 6 also. Morgan has given the album a 7 on Rate Your Music, and August has passed on his rating of 5. And Jake, that leaves you.
My 3 favorite tracks are Color of the Sky, Summer Set Fire to the Rain, and Dandelion Wine. Least favorite is definitely Buried in the Sun, and I give the album a 5 out of 10.
All right, so that gives us an average rating of 5.8, which,
yikes,
is
a 5 point anything average is just is an unfortunate numerical rating to have, frankly.
Yeah,
you're not in great company.
I mean, yeah, so they've beaten Donda, but they've still fallen short of the latest Bleachers album. So
wow,
whatever.
That's
it's whatever. Okay, well, that basically wraps it up for our main episode this week of the Jams Tea podcast. Let us know what you think of either of the albums we've talked about today. If you have anything to add to the discussions that we didn't mention, we'd love to hear from you in the comments below, as per usual. Make sure you stick around for our record club this week, celebrating 10 years of La Dispute's Wildlife. Connor will be joining us for that, as well as will he be joining us for our 1991 retrospective, which is happening on Thursday on Soundgarden's Bad Motor Finger. Stick around for that. And as always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, Taco Bell, think outside the bun.